My son can't breathe, Vivian screamed as she burst through the glass doors of the Chicago Mercy Hospital emergency room, her twin children clinging to her, one limp in her arms, the other sobbing hard at her side. The fluorescent lights smeared and swam as she staggered forward, her voice cracking under the weight of panic. She was only a poor nurse, an exhausted single mother, and now she was watching her little boy slip away in her arms. Suddenly, the door to the VIP area flew open. A man stepped out. Not a doctor. Black suit, white shirt, gray eyes cold as steel. He wasn't wearing a lab coat, yet nurses and physicians parted to either side as if they'd just seen death itself. He strode straight toward Vivian, his voice razor-sharp, heavy with command. "Give him to me. Now." Vivian froze. Her heart dropped into a chasm. The blood in her veins turned to ice. She knew that voice. She knew those bleak gray eyes. She had seen him only once, 5 years ago, on the fateful night that changed everything, the night she ran from an abusive husband, collapsed at the entrance of a luxury hotel, and was carried upstairs by a stranger into a room. But he didn't look at her. Not yet. His entire focus locked onto the boy gasping in her arms, the small chest barely rising anymore. "Ambulance. Room 3. Immediately," he shouted. Nurses came running from every direction, obeying him on instinct. No one dared ask who he was. No one dared block his path. The other child clutched Vivian's leg and cried through hiccups. "Mom, is Noah going to die?" Vivian couldn't answer. Her throat seized shut. Her heart hammered like a war drum. The world pitched and spun as that man vanished through the double doors with her son. The doors slammed closed, and with that sound, her past blew wide open. She had spent 5 years trying to forget him. 5 years raising twins alone in a damp apartment in the slums. 5 years working herself to the bone, sleeping 3 hours a night, eating whatever scraps the children left behind. 2 children whose existence he didn't even know about. 5 years wondering if the man from that night had been real, or only a dream. 5 years not knowing she had slept with the most notorious Mafia boss in all of Chicago. And now he was the only one who could save her child. The only one she prayed would remember her. The only one she feared would remember her. Because if he looked into those children's eyes, those same cold gray eyes that mirrored his, he would know the truth. And Vivian didn't know what was more terrifying. The devil who didn't recognize his own children, or the devil who did, and came to claim them. But before we go into the story, if you enjoy emotional stories like this, please hit the like button to support me. Share this video with the people you know who love drama, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the stories to come. Now then, let's begin. Vivian sat on the ice-cold plastic chair in the emergency waiting room, both arms wrapped tight around Liam, as if the boy were the only lifeline left in a storm. The 5-year-old trembled against his mother's chest, the tears on his cheeks already dried. But his gray eyes were still red-rimmed, still fixed on the double doors where his brother had just vanished. The fluorescent lights above flickered in a steady rhythm. The sounds of machines from the patient rooms pulsed through the corridor like the heartbeat of a massive monster breathing, and Vivian felt every passing second stretch out like a century. 2 hours. 2 hours since that man had taken Noah away. 2 hours of sitting here, not knowing whether her son was still alive or already dead. Liam lifted his face to hers, his voice hoarse from crying too much. "Mom, is Noah going to die?" Vivian swallowed hard, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. "No, sweetheart. Noah's going to be okay," she said, even though she didn't believe her own words. Liam fell quiet for a moment, then asked again, innocent in a way that cut into Vivian's heart like a blade. "Who is that man, Mom?" He looked so nice. Everyone was scared of him. Vivian didn't answer. She didn't know how she could. How could she explain to a 5-year-old that the man who had just saved his brother might be the biological father he had never met? How could she say she had seen him only once, on a rainy night 5 years ago, and then he disappeared as if he had never existed at all? Liam kept watching her, with those cold gray eyes exactly like that man's. "Mom, does he look like Dad? I think he has eyes like mine." Vivian's heart tightened, as if a fist had closed around it. She shut her eyes, and memory crashed over her like a tidal wave that couldn't be held back. 5 years ago, a night of rain pouring down over Chicago. Vivian ran through the downpour, barefoot, dress torn, face bruised purple, ribs broken and aching so badly that every breath felt like torture. Derek had beaten her. This time, he had almost killed her. She fled while he lay passed out drunk, carrying nothing but fear and the will to survive. She didn't know how long she ran, or how far, only that when her legs could no longer hold her, she collapsed right in front of a luxury hotel, the Peninsula Chicago, a place people like her were never meant to enter. She lay there in the rain, thinking she was going to die. Then a black Rolls-Royce pulled up. The door opened. A man stepped out. She couldn't see his face clearly through the curtain of rain, only the tall silhouette, the expensive leather shoes stopping right in front of her. Silence. She waited for him to walk away, the way so many others had when they saw a bruised girl lying on the sidewalk. But he didn't leave. He crouched down, and she saw gray eyes cold as steel, but not cruel. He studied her for a long moment, then turned and spoke to someone behind him. "Take her up to my room." His voice wasn't a request, it was an order, and people obeyed as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Vivian didn't remember how she was carried upstairs. She only remembered waking to find her wounds bandaged, and that man sitting in the chair beside the bed, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what had happened. He only sat there, as if his presence alone was enough. And that night, somewhere between pain and gratitude, between despair and a thin, fragile thread of hope, Vivian let him come close. She didn't know who he was. She didn't ask. The next morning, she woke up alone. On the table sat $50,000 in cash and a scrap of paper with a scrawled line, "Disappear. Don't ever come back." She did exactly that. She took the money, disappeared, divorced Derek, and tried to build a life again. 2 months later, she found out she was pregnant. Twins. Liam's voice yanked Vivian back into the present. "Mom, you're crying." Vivian lifted a hand to her cheek and only then realized tears were running down her face. She wiped them away quickly, forcing a smile for her child. "I'm fine, sweetheart." She lied. She had been lying for 5 years, lying to the boys that their father was far away, lying to herself that she didn't need anyone, lying that the past was over and would never come back. But the past never truly goes away. It only waits. And tonight, it had returned, wearing the face of the man she had tried to forget for 5 years. Then, abruptly, footsteps echoed down the quiet hallway. Vivian looked up, and the emergency room doors swung open. He stepped out, his suit stained with blood, his hair slightly mussed, but his gray eyes still cold and powerful the way she remembered. He stood there for a second, sweeping his gaze across the waiting area, and then his eyes stopped on her, stopped on Liam in her arms, stopped on the child's gray eyes, identical to his own. Vivian watched him go rigid, watched the color drain from his face, watched the way he stared at Liam as if he were looking into a mirror, seeing himself 30 years earlier, and she knew, in that instant, the secret she had carried for 5 years had been exposed completely. Cade stood there like a stone statue, his gray eyes still locked on Liam. Vivian saw his jaw clench, saw his chest rise and fall faster, saw the way he tried to control every muscle in his face, and failed miserably. A nurse hurried to his side and said something, but he didn't hear her. He only stared at the child in Vivian's arms, staring as if he were trying to solve a riddle whose answer he already knew but didn't dare admit. Then he spoke, his voice rough and thick. "He's alive." Those 2 words hit Vivian like a fist to the chest. She crumpled, her knees striking the cold floor, tears spilling out in a rush she could no longer hold back. All the fear, all the strain, everything she'd forced herself to swallow for the last 2 hours, broke loose like a dam giving way. Noah was alive. Her son was alive. She sobbed, her shoulders shaking in waves, and Liam panicked, clinging to her. "Mom, don't cry. Noah didn't die." Cade didn't move. He stayed where he was, looking down at the woman kneeling at his feet, looking at the child wrapped around her, and he felt as if someone had ripped all the air out of his lungs. The boy's gray eyes, the black hair, the bridge of the nose, that stubborn chin. He had seen that face every day in the mirror for 36 years. Slowly, he turned his head and looked through the window into the emergency room where Noah lay. The child had been fitted with a breathing tube, his skin still pale, but his chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. And his face was the same as the boy out here, the same as Cade. Cade felt the room tilt. He had lived 36 years in the underworld, had watched death up close, had ordered men killed, had faced situations ordinary people couldn't even imagine. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. He turned back to Vivian, the woman struggling to stand, eyes red, hair in disarray, her nurse's uniform wrinkled and rumpled. And he recognized her. Not just the woman in the waiting room tonight, but the girl from 5 years ago, the girl in the rain. His voice came out colder than he meant, but he couldn't control it. How old are they? Vivian looked up, tears still sliding down her cheeks. She knew this question was coming. She had feared it for 5 years. 5, she whispered. Silence. Silence that stretched until it stole the breath from the air. Cade closed his eyes, his mouth pressed into a hard line. 5 years old. 5 years ago. Everything clicked together like pieces of a picture he didn't want to see. He opened his eyes, and this time his voice wasn't cold anymore. It cracked, as if someone had shattered the ice around him. 5 years ago. The peninsula. The girl in the rain. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Vivienne nodded, tears pouring freely. She couldn't say a word. Her throat locked up, and all she could do was nod, admitting the truth she'd buried for 5 years. Cade took a step back, as if someone had punched him in the chest. He lifted a hand and dragged it over his face, trying to breathe, trying to steady the storm roaring inside him. 5 years. He had children for 5 years, and didn't know. 2 children. Twins. They had grown up without him, had learned to speak, learned to walk, learned to laugh, learned to cry without him. They had slept in rooms he'd never seen, eaten meals he'd never made, said Mom thousands of times, and never once said Dad. 5 years, 1,825 days. He had missed everything. Liam tugged timidly at his mother's hand, his voice tiny. Mom, what's wrong with him? Is he okay? Vivian didn't know how to answer. She only held her child tighter, as if she could shield him from the storm about to break. Cade heard the boy's voice, and he looked down at him. Looked into gray eyes identical to his own, at a small face tilted up with curiosity laced with fear. His son. This was his son, and he didn't even know his name. Liam, Vivian said, as if she could read his thoughts. His name is Liam, and the one in there is Noah. Liam. Noah. Cade repeated the 2 names inside his head, and it felt as if someone had carved them into his bones. Names he should have known from the day they were born, names he should have spoken every day. He looked at Vivienne, and for the first time since he walked out of that emergency room, he truly looked at her, not as a stranger, but as the mother of his children, the woman who had carried the pregnancy alone, given birth alone, raised 2 boys alone for 5 years. While where had he been? What had he been doing? Living in a $1 million penthouse, running an underground empire, sleeping with women whose names he didn't bother to remember, while she fought for her life by herself. Why? The word came out like a painful whisper. Forgive me. I should have looked for you. I should have never let you walk away that night. Vivian lifted her head, her brown eyes meeting his, and in that gaze, Cade didn't see fear. He saw anger. He saw hurt. He saw 5 years of loneliness and exhaustion. Tell you? Her voice shook, but not from fear. How was I supposed to tell you? She stopped, drew in a deep breath, then went on, each word like a bullet fired straight into Cade's chest. You disappeared. You left money and a note telling me to vanish. Where did you think I was supposed to find you? Cade stood there, silent. And for the first time in his life, the most notorious mafia boss in Chicago didn't know what to say. Vivian felt anger flare up in her chest, like a fire that had been smothered for too long. 5 years. 5 years of silence. 5 years of swallowing her tears. 5 years of telling herself she didn't need anyone, that she could raise her children alone without the man who had abandoned her. And now he stood here asking why she hadn't told him, as if she were the one at fault, as if she had deliberately hidden the boys from him. She shot to her feet, ignoring Liam's frightened grip on her leg, ignoring the nurses and patients in the waiting room turning to stare. I didn't know who you were. Her voice rang out, louder than she'd meant it to, but she didn't care anymore. 5 years of silence was enough. Do you understand? I didn't know who you were. You didn't give me your name. You didn't leave a phone number. You only left money and a note telling me to disappear. Cade stood there, saying nothing, but his jaw was clenched so hard Vivian could see the cords standing out along his neck. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. I tried to find you. You think I didn't try? Her voice trembled, and tears rose again. But this time, they weren't tears of fear or relief. These were the tears of 5 years of bitterness. When I found out I was pregnant, I went back to the peninsula. You know what they told me? They said the guest in that suite had checked in under a corporate alias and refused to disclose any information. There was nothing. As if that night had never happened. As if you had never existed. She drew a shaky breath, trying to steady her voice, and failing badly. I called the hotel hotline 27 times. 27 times. Begging them to check the records again. They said there was nothing. I searched online, searched for any clue about the man who drove a black Rolls-Royce that night. Nothing. You were a ghost. You didn't exist in any record, on any website, anywhere. How was I supposed to tell you when you didn't want to be found? Cade was still silent, but Vivian saw something shift in his eyes. The coldness was starting to melt, replaced by something she didn't recognize. Pain? Guilt? She didn't know, and she didn't care anymore. I gave birth alone, she went on, her voice lower now, more exhausted. In a public hospital, with no one beside me. Twins, a high-risk pregnancy, nearly died on the delivery table. And when I woke up, my babies were in intensive care because they were premature, and I had to sign the papers alone, pay the hospital bills alone, bring them home alone. Her voice caught. Where were you when Noah had a high fever and seizures at 8 months old? Where were you when Liam cried all night from teething and I didn't sleep for 3 straight days? Where were you when I had to work 2 jobs at the same time just to afford formula? She stopped, breathing hard, and looked straight into his eyes. Don't, ever, ask me why I didn't tell you. The waiting room went so silent it felt suffocating. Even the nurses stopped what they were doing, watching them with anxious faces. Liam clung to his mother's leg, trembling, not understanding what was happening, only knowing it was something serious. Cade stood there, and for the first time, Vivian saw the armor of the infamous Mafia boss crack. He lifted a hand and rubbed his face, and when he lowered it, his gray eyes weren't cold anymore. They were rimmed with red. 5 years, he whispered, his voice no longer the voice of a man who gave orders, who controlled everything. It was the voice of a man who had just realized he'd lost something he could never get back. 5 years I had children and didn't know. He stepped back and leaned against the wall, as if his legs no longer had the strength to hold him upright. They grew up without me. They learned to talk, to walk, had their first days of preschool, and I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything at all. His voice broke on the last words, and Vivian saw him close his eyes, as if he were trying to swallow something down. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times over the last 5 years. She had imagined that if she ever saw him again, she would scream in his face, punch his chest, pour every ounce of resentment onto him. But now, seeing him there, shoulders sagging, eyes reddened, voice splintering, she didn't feel satisfied. She only felt tired. Tired all the way into her bones. Cade was quiet for a long time. Then he opened his eyes. He drew in a deep breath, trying to pull himself together, though Vivian could see it was only a thin shell covering the storm inside. Go in with him, he said, his voice rough. Noah needs you beside him when he wakes up. Vivian hesitated, not sure whether she should leave Cade alone in this state. But then he looked at her and added, only 3 words, yet they made her shiver. This isn't over. Then he turned away and walked toward the VIP area, leaving Vivian standing there with Liam clinging to her leg. This isn't over. Those 3 words clung to Vivian like a curse as she led Liam into the emergency room, staring at Noah lying peacefully on the hospital bed. She didn't know what was more terrifying, Cade Thornton in anger, or Cade Thornton wanting to take his children back. And deep in her heart, she knew her life, the quiet life she had fought to build for 5 years, would never be the same again. Cade sat in his private office on the top floor of the building he owned, gray eyes fixed on the file Finn had just set in front of him. Beyond the glass, Chicago sprawled at his feet like a kingdom, but he couldn't see anything except the numbers on the page. Vivian Carter, 27 years old, a nurse at St. Mary Hospital. Income $2,200 a month after taxes. Fixed expenses. Rent $1,100. Childcare, $600. Utilities and other bills, $450. Total expenses, $2,150. Remaining $50 a month. $50. Cade read that number again, unable to believe his own eyes. That woman had been living on $50 a month while raising 2 children. He kept reading. Student debt, $45,000. Old medical debt, $12,000. Total debt, $57,000. Home address, a cramped tenement room on Chicago's South Side, in the area with the highest crime rate in the city. Cade slammed the folder shut, his jaw grinding tight. His sons, children with Thornton blood, were living in the slums. He stood, grabbed his car keys. "Where are you going, boss?" Finn asked. "To see how my kids are living." Cade drove to the South Side as the city sank into darkness. He parked the Rolls-Royce in front of a rundown apartment building and immediately felt the eyes of the men lingering in the alley. They looked at the car, watched him step out, and street instinct made them back away. They didn't know who he was, but they knew he was dangerous. Cade walked into the building, climbed 3 flights of sagging stairs, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath each step. The air carried a faint stink of dampness and urine. He stopped at the door of apartment 37, where Vivian and the boys lived, knowing they were still at the hospital. He opened the door easily, the cheap lock no challenge for him. The moment he stepped inside, Cade felt as if someone had driven a knife into his chest. The apartment was so small it felt suffocating. A living room that doubled as a bedroom, a tiny kitchen corner, a shared bathroom for the entire floor. The walls were peeling, mildew spreading in a dark bloom along the corner of the ceiling. The boy's mattress was torn at one edge, patched with mismatched scraps of cloth. He opened the refrigerator. Milk, eggs, greens, a little chicken, all of it the cheapest things money could buy. No snacks, no ice cream, nothing a normal 5-year-old would beg for. Cade shut the fridge and moved to the closet. Vivian's clothes, 5 nurse uniforms, 2 old pairs of jeans, a few faded t-shirts, no dresses, no nice things, nothing for herself beyond what she needed to go to work and survive. The boys' clothes were neat, clean, folded carefully, all of it second-hand, but tended to, mended where it tore, washed until it was spotless. She had given them everything she had. Then Cade saw the drawing. Taped to the wall beside the boy's mattress was a crayon picture. 4 people holding hands. A woman with brown hair, clearly Vivian. 2 small children, grinning wide. And the 4th, a tall figure with no face, only a black shadow. Beneath the picture, in a child's scrawled handwriting, it said, "My family, Mom, Noah, Liam, and Dad somewhere." Cade stood there staring at the drawing, and it felt as if someone had ripped his chest open. His son had drawn him as a shadow, an absence, a question with no answer. He turned away, and his eyes stopped on a sheet of paper on the table. A hospital bill from last night. $8,700. That was almost 4 times Vivian's monthly income. What was she supposed to do? Borrow more? Work extra shifts? Starve herself to pay the cost of saving her child? Cade pulled out his phone and called Finn. "Boss, get the penthouse on the Gold Coast ready. 3 bedrooms, toys, books, kids' clothes, everything, the best." Silence for a beat. "For who, boss?" "For my kids." Cade looked around the apartment again, looked at the drawing with the faceless father, and his voice turned cold as steel. "Move them to the penthouse. Tonight." Then he stepped out of the apartment and closed the door behind him. But Cade didn't know that Vivian Carter wasn't a woman who bent easily. She had survived 5 years of hell without anyone. She had fought alone, fallen, and gotten back up alone, and she wouldn't let anyone, not even a Mafia boss, come in and give orders over her life. Their war had only just begun. Noah opened his eyes the next morning, just as the first sunlight brushed the hospital room window. Vivian had sat by his bed all night, dark circles carved beneath her eyes from lack of sleep. But she didn't care. She only needed to see her son's gray eyes open, only needed to hear his weak voice call, "Mom." And every ounce of exhaustion fell away. Liam was curled up on the chair beside them, sleeping hard, still in the same clothes from last night. Vivian held Noah's hand, tears spilling despite everything she'd tried to hold back. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" Noah blinked, took in the unfamiliar room, then looked at her. "I'm thirsty, and my throat hurts." Vivian hurried to pour water into a cup, helping him drink in small sips. She was wiping Noah's mouth when the door opened. Cade stepped in, still in the same black suit as the night before, but with a fresh shirt. His gray eyes swept the room, paused on Noah in the bed, then shifted to Vivian. She caught something in his gaze she couldn't name. something softer than the coldness she'd seen before, but it vanished fast as he moved closer to the bed. Noah studied the stranger with curiosity edged by caution. "Who are you?" His voice was raspy, his throat still sore. Cade stopped beside the bed, and Vivienne saw his jaw tighten for a brief moment before he answered. His voice lowered, nothing like the cold, commanding tone she'd heard last night. "I'm the one who helped you last night, and I'm the one who won't let this happen to you again." Noah tilted his head, looking up at Cade with gray eyes identical to his. "Are you Mom's friend?" That innocent question dropped silence between Cade and Vivienne. Vivienne didn't know how to answer, and she wasn't sure what Cade would say. But before either of them could speak, Liam woke up, rubbed his eyes, and when he saw his brother awake, he slid off the chair and ran to the bed. "Noah, you're awake! I was so scared!" The two boys hugged, and Vivienne saw Cade standing there watching them with an expression she couldn't read. Pain, regret, hunger. She didn't know, and she didn't have time to find out. Cade turned to her, his voice returning to that familiar control. "You're moving in with me. I've already prepared a room for you and the boys." Vivienne rose, instinct placing her body between Cade and her children. "No." Cade lifted an eyebrow. "You're living in the slums. Your apartment has mold on the walls and a lock a 10-year-old could break. You think I'm going to let my children keep living there? My children." Vivienne stressed the words, her voice shaking but firm. "They're my children. I've raised them for 5 years. Alone. Without you, without anyone. And I'm going to keep doing it." "You're $57,000 in debt," Cade said, his calm so steady it was infuriating. "Last night's hospital bill is $8,700. How are you going to pay it? Starve yourself for a few more months." Vivienne felt as if he'd slapped her. He'd investigated her. He knew everything. "That's none of your business," she forced out through her teeth. "They're my children. That's my business." Vivienne waited for him to argue, waited for the order, the pressure, the threat. That was what she'd learned to expect in her marriage to Derek. But Cade didn't do any of that. He looked at her for a long moment, gray eyes measuring something she couldn't see. Then he exhaled and pulled a black business card from his jacket pocket, with only a string of phone numbers, no name, no title. He set it on the table beside the hospital bed. "When you need it, call me, anytime, for anything." Vivienne stared at the card, then at him, saying nothing. Cade turned and headed for the door, but before he opened it, he stopped, not looking back. His voice so low Vivienne had to strain to catch it. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met." Then he walked out, and the door clicked shut softly behind him. Vivienne stood there, her heart racing, her hand drifting without thought to the black card. She didn't know what to think. That man, the cold Mafia boss everyone in the hospital feared, had just told her she was strong and stepped back when she refused him. He hadn't forced her. He hadn't threatened her. He had only offered her a path and left her to choose. "Mom, who was that?" Noah asked from the bed. Vivienne swallowed hard, slid the black card into her pocket. "Nobody, sweetheart," she lied. "Just someone I used to know." But deep down, she knew it was a lie. And as she felt the black card in her pocket, she didn't know that only 3 days later, she would have to call that number in desperation, begging for help from the man she had just refused. 3 days after Noah was discharged, Vivienne thought everything would go back to normal. She brought the boys home to their small apartment on the south side, forcing herself to forget Cade's cold, gray stare, forcing herself to forget the black card still tucked in her coat pocket. She went back to work, back to 12-hour shifts, back to the life she'd been living for 5 years. But fate wouldn't let her rest. At 3 in the morning, the rasping sound of breathing from the children's mattress jolted Vivienne awake. She snapped on the light, and her heart seemed to stop when she saw Liam. The little boy was sitting up, both hands clutching his throat, face drained pale, lips tinged slightly blue, trying to pull air in, but every breath came with a terrifying wheeze, not as severe as Noah that night, but enough for Vivienne to know this wasn't an ordinary cold. "Mom, I can't breathe," Liam whispered, gray eyes wide with fear as he looked at her. Vivienne pulled him into her arms, hands shaking as she felt his forehead, checked his temperature, checked his pulse. She was a nurse. She knew these symptoms, and she knew she needed to get him to a hospital immediately, but the public hospital would mean hours of waiting. Noah's hospital bill still wasn't paid. She didn't have health insurance for herself. She had less than $100 left in her account. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the coat hanging on the wall. The black business card was still there, ice cold against her fingertips. She stared at it, hesitating, pride and fear tearing at each other inside her. Then Liam wheezed again, and all her pride dissolved. She dialed. The phone rang once, twice. Then Cade's voice came through, fully awake even though it was 3 a.m, as if he hadn't slept at all. "Vivian?" "Liam." Her voice caught. Liam can't breathe. Silence for a beat. Then Cade's voice turned sharp as a blade. "Address. Don't move. I'm coming now." 12 minutes later, an engine growled outside the building. Vivian carried Liam down the stairs, Noah still half asleep running after them. Cade was already there with the car door open, his face cold as ice, but his eyes were burning. He didn't speak. He just took Liam from Vivian's arms, settled the boy into the car, then motioned for her and Noah to get in. The car tore through the night, not toward the public hospital Vivian knew, but toward a private building in the Gold Coast, where the logo of a private hospital glowed in the dark. The Thornton Family Hospital, a place that served only those Cade allowed. After that, everything happened like a whirlwind. Liam was rushed into emergency, and the Thornton family's private physician, a salt-and-pepper-haired man named Bennett Shaw, arrived immediately. Vivian sat in the VIP waiting room, holding Noah, who was trembling, forcing herself to stay calm even as a storm raged inside her. 2 hours later, Dr. Shaw stepped out, his expression grave. Cade rose at once, and Vivian saw his entire body go taut, like a string pulled tight. "He's stable," Dr. Shaw said, but there was no relief in his voice. "However, I need to speak with both of you. In private." Vivian sat Noah down on the chair, told him to stay put, then followed Dr. Shaw and Cade into a private room. What the doctor said next struck her chest like hammer blows. "Both boys have recurrent respiratory papillomatosis." Dr. Shaw looked at Cade, then at Vivian. "It's a hereditary condition caused by a gene mutation. It makes small growths develop in the airway, creating obstruction. If it isn't monitored and treated with regular surgeries, it can become life-threatening." Vivian felt as if someone had sucked all the air out of her lungs. Regular surgeries? Possibly once a year, possibly more, depending on how quickly the growths return. For life. Dr. Shaw paused, his gaze cautious as it landed on Cade. "This condition is inherited from the father." Silence. Silence that stretched until it felt impossible to breathe. Vivian looked at Cade and watched the color drain from his face. He stood there, utterly still, as if someone had nailed him to the floor. Then he turned and walked out without a word. Vivian wanted to run after him, but Dr. Shaw still had more to explain about the treatment plan, the surgery schedule, the cost. She tried to focus, tried to hold every detail in her mind, even as her thoughts spun. When she finally stepped out of the room, she looked around for Cade and didn't see him anywhere. Noah had dozed off on the chair. Vivian draped her coat over him, then walked down the hallway, instinct guiding her toward a dark corner at the very end, and she found him. Cade was sitting on the floor, back against the wall, head bowed, both hands covering his face. His shoulders were shaking. Vivian stopped, not knowing whether she should go closer. This was the Mafia boss everyone feared. This was the man as cold as winter. But now he was there, alone in the dark, and she heard a strangled sound break from him. "I gave them this." His voice splintered, no longer the voice of a man who commanded. It was the voice of a father realizing he had hurt his children without ever knowing. "They're sick because of me. They'll suffer for the rest of their lives because of me." Vivian stood there a moment, watching the man collapse in front of her. Then she did something she never expected of herself. She went over and sat down beside him, her back against the cold wall, and she said nothing. The silence stretched on. The distant machines from the patient rooms pulsed like the building's heartbeat. Then Vivian spoke softly. "You didn't know. No one knew you carried that gene." Cade didn't look at her, still hiding his face in his hands. "Not knowing doesn't make me innocent. It also doesn't mean you have to carry it alone." Cade lifted his head, gray eyes rimmed red, and for the first time, Vivian didn't see a cold Mafia boss. She saw a grieving man, a guilty father, a human being like any other. He looked at her, saying nothing, but his eyes seemed to ask a question he didn't dare speak aloud. Vivian didn't answer. She simply sat there beside him in the cold hallway, letting him know he wasn't alone. And in that moment, in the hush of a hospital just before dawn, Vivian saw something she never expected. Even the devil could cry. And for the first time, they were no longer enemies. Liam had to stay in the hospital for 3 more days for observation, and during those 3 days, Vivian witnessed things that forced her to rethink everything. On the first night, she woke at 2 o'clock in the morning to a soft sound in the VIP room. She opened her eyes, and what she saw made her go still. Cade was sitting in the chair beside Liam's bed, his back slightly hunched, his head bent over a book. A small reading light washed his face, and Vivian could make out the title on the cover, How to Raise Twins, A Beginner's Guide. The most notorious mafia boss in Chicago was reading a parenting book at 2 in the morning. Vivian lay motionless, pretending to sleep, watching him through half-closed lashes. She saw Cade lift his head now and then to look at Liam, checking whether his breathing was steady, then drop his gaze back to the page. His lips moved with each line, as if he were trying to memorize every detail. On the second night, Vivian woke again, and this time she saw Cade sitting beside Liam's bed, with one hand holding his son's small hand, the other resting lightly on the boy's chest to feel each breath. He didn't sleep. He didn't leave. He simply sat there on guard, as if he feared that if he closed his eyes for even a second, something terrible would happen. On the third night, Noah woke in the middle of the night, frightened by a nightmare. Vivian started to get up, but Cade was faster. He sat down beside Noah, and in a clumsy voice, unused to this, he began to read a fairy tale aloud. His voice wasn't as gentle as a mother's, not as soothing as other mothers reading to their children, but Noah didn't care. The boy lay still, gray eyes fixed on Cade, and slowly his eyelids grew heavy, then slid shut. Cade read a few more pages anyway, even after Noah was fast asleep. Vivian lay there, silent tears slipping into her pillow. She had hated this man. She had resented him for 5 years. She had told herself she didn't need him, that the boys didn't need him. But watching him there, reading a book on fatherhood at 2 in the morning, holding his child's hand all night, reading stories in an awkward voice, she understood something she hadn't wanted to admit. The boys needed a father. They needed this man. No matter who he was, no matter what he did out there, they needed to know their father existed, that he cared, that he would stay awake all night just to make sure they kept breathing. The next morning, when Dr. Shaw said Liam could be discharged, Vivian made her decision. "I'll move in," she said, her voice calm but final. Cade was signing the discharge papers, and he lifted his head, gray eyes flashing with surprise he didn't manage to hide. "What did you say?" "I'm moving into your penthouse. With the boys." Vivian drew a deep breath. "But I have conditions." Cade set the pen down and straightened, his entire attention locking onto her. "I'm listening. First, I'm not your property. I'm not a servant, not a slave, not something you can order around. Do you understand?" Cade nodded, not interrupting. "Second, I'm still working. I'm a nurse. That's my profession. What I built with sweat and tears. You don't get to make me quit." "Fine. Third, you don't give me orders. I'm living there because the boys need their father, not because I need you. You don't have the right to control my life." Silence. Cade studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. Then he stepped closer, stopping in front of her, close enough for her to feel the heat of his body, but not close enough to touch. "I agree to all your conditions," he said, his voice low. "But I have one condition too." Vivian lifted her chin. "What is it?" "You have to let me protect you." His tone wasn't a command, and it wasn't a threat. It was a plea, almost urgent. "My world is dangerous, Vivian. There are people who want me dead, and if they find out about you, about the boys, they'll use you to get to me. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm not asking you to like me. I'm only asking you to let me protect you, for the boys." Vivian looked into those gray eyes, searching for lies, for calculation, but she found only sincerity and worry. "All right," she said, her voice smaller than she meant it to be. "I agree." Cade let out a breath, as if he'd just set down a weight too heavy to carry. But Vivian didn't know that this decision would change her life forever. She didn't know that by stepping into Cade Thornton's world, she was stepping into an underworld soaked in blood and secrets. And she didn't know that this decision would awaken ghosts from a past she thought she'd buried. Ghosts that had been waiting for their chance to come back for her. The 3-level penthouse on the Gold Coast overlooking Lake Michigan felt like an entirely different world from the damp little apartment on the south side where Vivian and the boys had lived for 5 years. The hardwood floors gleamed, the ceilings soared, and floor-to-ceiling windows opened onto a sweeping view of Chicago glittering at night. The boys' room was 3 times the size of their old place, packed with brand-new toys, storybooks, and 2 soft beds with superhero sheets Noah loved and dinosaur sheets Liam was obsessed with. But what surprised Vivian most wasn't the luxury of the penthouse. It was the way Cade Thornton was trying to learn how to be a father. On the first afternoon after they moved in, Vivian stood in the living room doorway, watching Cade sit on the floor with Noah and a complicated Lego set. The Mafia boss, the man all of Chicago feared, was frowning at a tiny piece, as if it were his sworn enemy. "Dad, that piece doesn't go there," Noah said, his voice so patient it was like he was teaching a slow student. "It goes over there." Cade stared at the piece, stared at the instructions, stared at the piece again, his face grave, as if he were decoding a conspiracy. He placed it where Noah pointed, and it was still wrong. Noah burst into laughter, bright and unrestrained, filling the room. "Dad, you're so bad at Lego." Vivian waited for Cade to get angry, or at least irritated, but he didn't. He only looked at Noah with something she couldn't quite name, something soft, something almost painful, and then he said, "Then teach me." And Noah did. A 5-year-old boy patiently showed his father how to fit each piece, and Cade, the cold Mafia boss, sat there and followed his son's every word, as if it were the most important order he'd ever been given. Beside them, Liam had spread out a pile of colored pencils and drawing paper, tugging at Cade's sleeve. "Dad, color with me." Cade looked down at the page, a dinosaur waiting to be filled in, and he picked up a pencil and began to color, clumsy and slipping outside the lines. Liam didn't laugh the way Noah had. He only tilted his head, patiently guiding his father's hand, showing him how to hold the pencil properly. "You have to go slow, Dad, like this." Vivian stood there, her chest tightening. This was the picture she'd dreamed of for 5 years. A father for her boys, a man sitting there, trying to learn how to play with them, even though he clearly didn't know a thing about Legos or coloring. But she didn't allow herself to soften. Not yet. That night, when Cade came down to the kitchen where his private chef had prepared an elaborate meal, he found Vivian feeding the boys in their room. "Aren't you eating dinner with us?" Vivian didn't look at him. "I eat with the boys. You can eat with me." "I don't want to." Cade stood there for a moment, gray eyes holding something she didn't want to read. Then he turned away without another word. That night, and every night after, Vivian slept in her own room, locking the door even though she knew Cade would never enter without permission. She still got up at 5 in the morning, pulled on her nurse's uniform, and worked 12-hour shifts at St. Mary Hospital even though Cade had said she didn't need to work anymore. "I don't need your money," she told him. "I can take care of myself." She knew it bothered him. She saw his jaw tighten every time she refused to eat dinner with him, every time she kept her distance, every time she reminded him she was here for the boys, not for him. But he didn't push. He had promised. A week after they moved in, Vivian came home late from a shift and heard voices from the boys' room. She stopped in the doorway, careful not to let them see her. Noah was sitting on the bed, looking at Cade with gray eyes identical to his. "Dad, why weren't you with us from the beginning?" Vivian saw Cade go still. The question landed like a knife straight to the chest. She waited for him to lie, waited for him to come up with some excuse, some way to shift blame, to justify himself. But Cade didn't. He sat down beside Noah, drew a deep breath, and told the truth, his voice low and aching. "Because I didn't know you existed. That's my fault. I wasn't there when your mother needed me. I wasn't there when you were born. I wasn't there while you grew up. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry I was gone for 5 years." Silence followed. Then Noah did something Vivian hadn't expected. The boy climbed into Cade's lap, wrapped his arms around his father's neck, and said, his voice small but steady, "It's okay, Dad. You're here now." Vivian watched Cade hold his son, bury his face in Noah's hair, and his shoulders began to shake. She turned away, tears sliding down her cheeks even though she didn't want them to. She wouldn't allow herself to believe in him, not because he didn't deserve it, but because she was afraid. Afraid to open her heart and get hurt again. Afraid to trust and be abandoned again. She had built a wall around her heart for 5 years, and she wasn't ready to let anyone break it down. Not yet. But some ghosts refused to stay quiet in the grave, and one of them, a man Vivian thought had vanished from her life forever, was finding his way back. And he would come sooner than she thought. 5 years ago, the night Vivian ran, Chicago was drowning under sheets of rain. She still remembered every detail of that night, even though she'd tried to bury it in the deepest corner of her mind. Derek came home at 11 at night, drunk as always, eyes bloodshot, breath reeking of cheap whiskey. She tried to avoid him, tried to make herself invisible, but he found her in the kitchen where she was washing dishes, fighting to keep her hands from shaking. "What the hell are you looking at?" he roared, even though she wasn't looking at him at all. She didn't answer. She'd learned that answering only made things worse, but silence did too. Derek grabbed her by the hair, dragged her through the living room, and threw her to the floor. She hit face first, tried to push herself up, but he kicked her in the back and pinned her down. "Who do you think you are?" he snarled, and drove his fist into her stomach. She folded in on herself, airless, tears spilling. "You're mine. You hear me? Even if you die, you're still mine." He beat her, punched her, kicked her, slapped her. She couldn't count how many times. She only knew she curled into herself, covered her head, tried to survive each second. When he finally stopped, she lay there, unmoving, not crying, barely breathing. She heard him stumble into the bedroom, heard the bed creak, then the heavy sound of his snoring. She stayed on the floor for another hour, waiting, making sure he was deep asleep. Then she crawled, inch by inch, centimeter by centimeter. She crawled to the door, not daring to stand, not daring to make a sound. Her ribs were broken, she knew it. Every breath hurt so badly she wanted to pass out, but she didn't stop. She opened the door, crawled outside, then forced herself up and ran. Ran into the rainy night, barefoot, dress torn, no money, no phone, nothing but the will to live. She never went back. She divorced Derek through a lawyer, never seeing him, never meeting his eyes. She changed her address, changed her phone number, changed everything she could change. She thought he was gone from her life forever. She was wrong. 2 weeks after moving into Cade's penthouse, Vivian finished a late shift at St. Mary Hospital. The clock read 10 at night. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few cars belonging to night staff. She was walking toward her beat-up old Toyota, keys already in her hand, when a voice came out of the darkness. "Long time no see, ex-wife." Vivian went rigid. Her heart stopped for one horrible instant, then slammed into a frantic gallop like it was trying to break through her ribs. She knew that voice. She'd heard it in nightmares for 5 years. Derek stepped out of the shadows, the same face, the same twisted smile. But something was different. He wasn't the filthy, drunken addict she remembered. He was dressed cleaner, standing straighter, eyes clear and cold, more dangerous. "You think you can hide from me?" Derek moved closer, and Vivian backed away until her spine met the car door. "I've been looking for you for 5 years, and finally, thanks to a kind friend, I know exactly where you are." Vivian tried to keep her voice from shaking. "We're divorced. You don't have the right to come near me." Derek laughed, a sound so cold it made her skin crawl. "Divorced? You think that piece of paper means anything? You're mine, Vivian. You've always been mine." He tilted his head, his eyes lighting with something poisonous. "But I didn't come here to take you back. No, I've got something much better." He pulled out his phone and held it up so she could see a photo of her walking into Cade's penthouse building, the 2 boys holding her hands. "You're living with Cade Thornton," Derek sneered, "the most notorious Mafia boss in Chicago, and you've got 2 kids with him. Interesting." Vivian felt as if ice water had been poured straight into her veins. "What do you want?" "Simple." Derek shoved the phone back into his pocket and folded his arms over his chest. $200,000. You give me the money and I disappear. You don't. I sell what I know about you and those brats to Castellano. Vivian didn't know who Castellano was, but the way Derek said the name, with smug satisfaction, told her it was something terrible. "I'm working for Castellano now," Derek went on, as if he'd read her thoughts. He'd love to know Cade Thornton's weakness. "And you, my dear ex-wife, are that weakness." "I don't have $200,000, Vivian whispered, her voice trembling. "Then go beg your Mafia lover." Derek shrugged. "You've got a week. If you don't have the money, I call Castellano, and trust me, he'll be real happy to hear about those 2 little gray-eyed boys." He turned and started back into the shadows, then paused and looked over his shoulder at her one last time. "Oh, and don't be stupid enough to tell Thornton. If I see any sign he knows about this, I'll send the kid's address to Castellano immediately. You understand?" Then he disappeared into the night. Vivian stood there shaking, unable to move. The Chicago night cut like a blade, but that cold was nothing compared to the fear closing around her heart. Derek was back, and he knew about the boys. She wanted to call Cade. She wanted to tell him, but Derek's threat echoed in her head, and she knew she couldn't risk it. Not with Noah and Liam's lives on the line. Vivian drove back to the penthouse in silence, hands locked around the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. When she stepped inside, Cade was sitting in the living room, waiting for her the way he did every night. He looked at her, frowning. "What's wrong? You're pale." "Nothing." She lied, her voice harder than she meant it to be. "I'm just tired." Then she walked straight into her room, shut the door, and leaned back against the wall as tears slid silently down her cheeks. Derek smiled as he disappeared into the dark, and Vivian knew the nightmare from 5 years ago had never truly ended. 3 days after the encounter with Derek, while Vivian was still drowning in fear and had no idea what to do, a sleek black Bentley rolled to a stop outside St. Mary Hospital right as her shift ended. A man in a black suit stepped out, his face carved from stone, and walked straight up to her. "Miss Vivian Carter?" She nodded, her heart kicking faster. "Mrs. Margaret Thornton wants to see you. Now." It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. Vivian sat in the car, watching Chicago slide past the window, trying to brace herself for what was coming. She'd heard Cade mention his mother a few times, always with a cautious, respectful tone. Margaret Thornton, the woman behind the Thornton Empire, the one who had built it and held the family together for 30 years after her husband died. The woman even Cade had to be careful with. The Bentley stopped in front of an estate in the Chicago suburbs, a house that looked like a small castle with gray stone walls, towering iron gates, and gardens trimmed to perfection. Guards stood everywhere, their eyes cold as they watched. Vivian was led into the sitting room, where Margaret Thornton sat in a deep red velvet armchair like a queen on her throne. She was 62, her white hair swept into a neat bun, her posture rigidly straight, her gray eyes the same as Cade's but colder, sharper, more ruthless. She didn't stand when Vivian entered. She simply sat there, looking Vivian up and down as if she were assessing a cheap piece of merchandise. "Sit," Margaret ordered, her voice not loud, but absolute. Vivian sat in the chair across from her, forcing her back straight, refusing to let the older woman see fear. The silence stretched. Margaret took a sip of tea, unhurried, as if Vivian wasn't worth her haste. Then she set the cup down, opened her mouth, and every word landed like a blade. "Who are you to dare give the Thorntons children without permission?" Vivian felt as if she'd been slapped, but she didn't let it show. "I don't believe having children requires anyone's permission." Margaret let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "And what do you think you are? A low-income nurse living in the slums, with an alcoholic husband in your past. And you think you're worthy of carrying the Thornton name?" Vivian clenched her hands on her thighs, nails biting into skin as she held back the anger flaring inside her. "My sons don't carry the Thornton name. They carry Carter." "Not yet," Margaret said, her tone threaded with threat. "But my son seems very determined to change that. And I want to know, how much for you to disappear?" Vivian lifted her head and met Margaret's eyes. "What did you just say?" "I asked how much money you want to leave my son's life, and take those 2 children with you," Margaret said calmly, as if she were negotiating a business contract. 1 million? 2 million? Say it. Everyone has a price." Vivian stood, her body trembling, but not from fear anymore, from fury. "I don't sell my children," she said, her voice shaking but final. "And I didn't hide them from your son. Your son disappeared. He left money and a note telling me to go. He didn't leave a name. He didn't leave a phone number. He didn't leave anything. I tried to find him. 27 calls to that hotel, with nothing to show for it. So don't stand here and blame me for what your son did." Margaret rose, her eyes darkening with something dangerous. "You dare speak to me that way? I'm telling the truth." Vivian didn't back down, even as her heart hammered wildly. "And if you think you can buy me with money, you've got the wrong woman. I lived 5 years without the Thorntons. I can keep living that way." The sitting room fell into taut silence. 2 women faced each other, neither willing to yield. Then the doors flew open. Cade walked in, his face ice cold, but his gray eyes burning. He'd heard everything. "Mother." His voice was sharp. "Enough." Margaret turned to her son, surprise flickering for an instant before the chill returned. "Cade, I'm only protecting you." "By humiliating the mother of my children?" Cade stepped forward and stood beside Vivian like a shield. She raised 2 boys alone for 5 years. She didn't ask for money. She didn't demand anything. And you're trying to buy her like she's merchandise? "You're protecting a street girl?" Margaret asked, her words sharp as knives. "I'm protecting the mother of my sons," Cade replied, unflinching. "And if you can't respect her, you won't see your grandsons. Ever." Silence. Margaret stared at her son, her eyes widening in shock. In 36 years, Cade had never argued with her, never put anyone above the family. Not until now. She looked at Vivian again, gray eyes cold as ice, filled with hostility and caution. Then she turned away and left the room without another word. Cade set a hand on Vivian's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Vivian nodded, though her heart was still racing. "I'm fine." But as she watched Margaret's silhouette vanish through the doorway, she knew this fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. Cade drove away from his mother's estate in silence, gray eyes fixed on the road ahead, his jaw clenched tight. Vivian sat in the passenger seat with her hands woven together on her lap, trying to control the shaking that still hadn't stopped. She had faced Margaret Thornton, and she hadn't backed down. But now, as the adrenaline drained away, she felt exhausted all the way to the bone. The car didn't head toward the penthouse. Instead, Cade turned onto a narrow road leading down to the edge of Lake Michigan, where the city lights shimmered across water as black as velvet. He stopped the car and killed the engine, but he didn't open the door. They sat there, staring out at the lake, a silence stretching until it felt hard to breathe. Then Cade spoke, his voice low and more tired than Vivian had ever heard it. "My mother isn't a bad person." Vivian said nothing, waiting. "She's just afraid," Cade went on, still looking out at the water, not turning to her. "My father was killed when I was 15, shot right in front of my mother. She had to take over this empire before her tears were even dry, had to raise me into someone who could survive in the underworld." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "In our world, weakness is death. Any weakness can be used by an enemy, and she thinks you'll make me weak." Silence. Vivian watched him, the hard lines of his face under the streetlight, the gray eyes carrying the weight of a lifetime. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what she wanted to say. "She's wrong," Cade said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. And for the first time since they'd gotten into the car, he turned and looked at her. Those gray eyes, cold and terrifying when he faced enemies, held something else now, something Vivian didn't dare name. "You don't make me weak, Vivian. You give me a reason to be stronger." Vivian felt her heart pounding so hard she was afraid he could hear it. She wanted to say something, wanted to argue, wanted to remind him she was here for the boys, not for him. But no words came. Instead, she did something she never expected of herself. Her hand moved, slowly, and settled on top of his hand resting on the steering wheel. Cade didn't flinch. He didn't take her hand, didn't look at her, didn't speak. He simply let his hand stay beneath hers, feeling the warmth of her small fingers trembling slightly. Vivian didn't look at him either. She looked out at Lake Michigan, at the lights trembling on the water, and felt warmth spread from the point where their hands touched. They sat there, not speaking, not looking at each other, but also not pulling away. It wasn't love. Vivian wasn't ready to call it love. But it wasn't hostility anymore, or reluctant alliance. It was a beginning of trust, a beginning of 2 strangers, thrown together by fate, learning how to trust and lean on each other. After a long while, Cade started the engine and drove back toward the penthouse. Vivian's hand stayed on his the whole way, and he still didn't pull away. But trust was a luxury in Cade Thornton's world, and someone was preparing to destroy it before it had a chance to grow. Cade sat in his private office in the penthouse, the light from the computer screen casting a pale glow across a face cold as stone. In front of him played a security video from the parking lot cameras at St. Mary Hospital, where a man stood in front of Vivian, his mouth moving with words Cade didn't need to hear to know they were threats. He'd had Vivian watched since the day she moved into the penthouse, not because he didn't trust her, but because he knew how dangerous his world was. He needed to know she was safe, and this video told him she wasn't. Cade rewound the footage, watched again and again, the way Vivian backed into her car door, the way she trembled, the way she tried to hold herself steady even though fear was written all over her. Then he studied the man, a face he recognized from the file Finn had brought him a few days earlier. Derek Simmons, Vivian's ex-husband, the one who had beaten her badly enough to break ribs 5 years ago. And now, he was working for Raymond Castellano. Castellano. The name made Cade's jaw clench so hard it nearly ground his teeth to dust. Castellano was the Thornton family's hereditary enemy, the Mafia boss who had been at war with Cade's father for 20 years before his father was killed. He was an old fox, patient, waiting for the right opening, and now he'd found Cade's weakness. Vivienne. And the boys. Cade snapped the laptop shut, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm against the wooden desk. He knew Vivienne was hiding something from him. He'd seen the way she came home that night, with her face drained pale, the way she lied and said she was just tired, the way she avoided his eyes for days afterward. He wanted to ask. He wanted to force the truth out of her. But he didn't. He waited for her to come to him on her own, to trust him enough to tell him the truth, because he knew if he pushed, she would only retreat farther, and he didn't want to lose her. Not now. Not when he was only beginning to understand what it felt like to have someone to protect. 3 days later, while Vivienne was at work and the boys were at preschool, a gift box was left outside the penthouse door. The guards checked it before bringing it inside, confirming there was no bomb, no poison. But when Vivienne came home earlier than usual and opened it, she wished it had been a bomb. 2 teddy bears lay inside. One blue, one brown. Their heads had been severed and placed beside their bodies like a blood-soaked warning. Beneath them lay a handwritten note. Such lovely children. They have their father's eyes. Vivienne stood there, her body locking up, her heart stopping for one horrific beat. Then a mother's instinct took over. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She calmly closed the box, carried it into her room, and hid it in the closet where the boys would never find it. Her hands shook, but she forced them still. She couldn't shake. Not now. She pulled out her phone and dialed Cade. He answered immediately. Vivienne? What is it? You need to come home. Her voice was so calm it was frightening. Right now. 15 minutes later. Cade walked into the penthouse, eyes sweeping the space for danger. Vivienne was waiting in the living room, her face pale but set with iron resolve. She didn't speak. She only led him into her bedroom, opened the closet, and handed him the gift box. Cade opened it, and for the first time in her life, Vivienne saw the devil for real. Not Cade angry, not Cade cold. This was Cade, ready to kill. His gray eyes darkened, his jaw locked, every line of his face hardening into stone. He read the note, then read it again, and each time, his gaze grew more deadly. Derek, Vivienne said, her voice finally trembling. My ex-husband. He found me last week in the hospital parking lot. He threatened to sell information about me and the boys to someone named Castellano if I didn't give him $200,000. She stopped, tears spilling even though she'd tried to hold them back. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. But he said if I told you, he'd send the boy's address to Castellano. And I was scared. I was so scared. I didn't know what to do. Cade set the box down, stepped forward, and did something Vivienne didn't expect. He pulled her into his arms. For the first time since that night 5 years ago, he held her. His embrace was strong and warm, wrapping around her, drawing her against his solid chest, holding her as if he feared she might disappear. Don't apologize. His voice was low, right beside her ear. You didn't do anything wrong. You were trying to protect the boys the only way you knew how. But from now on, you don't have to do it alone. He eased back, both hands settling on her shoulders, and looked straight into her eyes. From now on, we fight together. Do you understand? You're not alone anymore. Vivienne nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks, and for the first time since Derek appeared, she felt like she could breathe. Cade pulled her in again, tighter, longer, but over her shoulder, his eyes were ice cold, staring into the distance with calculation and hatred. Someone had threatened his children, and in Cade Thornton's world, that was a death sentence. A week after the bloody gift box, while Cade was focused on investigating and preparing a plan to deal with Derek and Castellano, an uninvited guest appeared at the penthouse. Margaret Thornton stepped out of the private elevator without warning, without an appointment. as if she had the right to go anywhere she pleased. The guards had called Cade, but he was in the middle of an important meeting with Finn downstairs. Vivian was in the kitchen, making lunch for the boys, when she heard familiar footsteps in the living room. She turned, and her heart sank when she saw Margaret standing there, still as imperious as the last time. But her eyes were different today, a little less sharp, a little more curious. "I came to see my grandchildren," Margaret said curtly. No greeting. Vivian wanted to refuse, wanted to tell her to leave, but she knew it wasn't her decision. Margaret was Noah and Liam's grandmother, no matter how she treated Vivian, and the boys had a right to know their grandmother. "They're in the playroom," Vivian said evenly. "I'll call them out for lunch." Margaret didn't answer. She simply followed Vivian into the dining area, sat down in the chair by the window, and watched. She watched Vivian call the boys from the playroom, her voice gentle and patient. She watched Noah and Liam come running out, faces smeared with paint, grinning wide. She watched the way Vivian wiped each face clean, never scolding, never showing irritation, even though her clothes were already stained with color from the boys' hands. Lunch began, and Margaret kept watching in silence. Liam, the more sensitive one, glanced at her now and then, timid and unsure. Noah was too busy telling his mother about the picture he'd just finished, his voice chattering like a little bird. In the middle of the meal, Liam reached too fast for his water and knocked the cup over, spilling it across the table. He froze in panic, eyes filling with tears, waiting to be yelled at. Vivian didn't get angry. She only grabbed a cloth, wiped the table, smoothed Liam's hair, and said softly, "It's okay, sweetheart. Everyone spills things. Just hold it a little more carefully next time." Liam burst into tears, not from fear, but from relief, then ran into his mother's arms. Vivian held him, kissed the top of his head, and Margaret watched the child melt against her, as if that embrace was the safest place in the world. After lunch, Noah tugged Vivian's hand, excited. "Mom, I want to show Grandma my drawing." Before Vivian could say anything, Noah had already run to fetch it and placed it in Margaret's hands, gray eyes shining with pride. "I drew my family." Margaret took the paper, and for the first time, the coldness on her face cracked. The drawing showed 4 people, holding hands under a blue sky with a smiling sun. A brown-haired woman, 2 small children, and a tall man. The man had a face. For the first time in all the pictures Noah and Liam had ever drawn, the father had a real face, no longer a shapeless dark shadow. Margaret lifted her head, and at that exact moment, Cade walked into the room. He stopped when he saw his mother, but before he could speak, Noah ran over and hugged his father's leg. "Dad, I already showed Grandma my drawing." And then something Margaret had never seen in 36 years happened. Cade smiled. Not the polite smile, not the cold smile he wore when facing enemies. A real smile, warm and gentle, meant only for the little boy clinging to his leg. Cade bent down, scooped Noah up, and said with open affection, "You drew it beautifully." Margaret stared at her son, at the way he held his child, at the smile on a face that had always been cold as ice, and she understood. She understood why Cade protected this woman. She understood why he was willing to stand against even his own mother for her. Because Vivian had brought her son something she never could. A real family. When Margaret stood to leave, she stopped in front of Vivian. The 2 women looked at each other without speaking for a long time. Then Margaret spoke, her voice still cool, but no longer as sharp as before. "You're raising them well. No apology, no embrace, no explanation." But Vivian understood. It was the first step. A small step, but a step. Vivian watched Margaret step back into the elevator, the doors sliding shut as the older woman disappeared. She didn't know that the next time they met, Margaret would bring her something she never could have imagined. The call came at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, just as Vivian had gotten back to the penthouse after her morning shift. It was an unknown number, but she knew who it was before she even heard the voice. "Miss me, ex-wife?" Derek sneered into the phone, his tone slick with smug satisfaction. "It's been a week and I still haven't seen the money. You think I was joking?" Vivian tightened her grip on the phone, her heart racing, but her voice stayed calm. "I'm trying to get the money. 200,000 isn't a small amount." "I don't care," Derek snarled, the smugness vanishing, replaced by the familiar aggression. "You've got until 6 o'clock tonight. You come meet me, alone. If I see anyone with you, or if you don't show up, I'll send the kid's location to Castellano immediately. You understand?" He rattled off an address, an abandoned warehouse on the south side, then hung up. Vivian stood there staring at the dark phone screen, and she knew it was a trap. Derek didn't want money. He wanted her. He'd always wanted her. Wanted to control her. Wanted to own her like an object. The money was only an excuse to drag her somewhere he could do whatever he wanted. 5 years ago, Vivian had run from Derek with broken ribs and a bruised face. 5 years ago, she'd been a victim, prey, a weak woman with no one to protect her. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She'd survived 5 years of hell on her own. She'd carried children, raised children, and rebuilt a life from ashes. She wasn't a victim anymore, and she wouldn't let Derek turn her into one again. Vivian didn't go like a fool. She sat down at the table and wrote a message for Cade, clearly stating the warehouse address and the time. I'm going to meet Derek. If I'm not back in 2 hours, he's got me. She slipped the message into the drawer of Cade's desk, where he'd be sure to find it when he returned from his meeting with Finn. She didn't tell him directly, because she knew he'd stop her. He'd go in her place. He'd turn this meeting into a war before she had a chance to do anything at all, and she needed time. She needed to face Derek one last time. Then Vivian went into her room and opened the medical kit she always kept from the hospital. She was a nurse. She understood medication. She knew what could make a grown man lose consciousness in a matter of seconds. She took out a small syringe and filled it with a fast-acting paralytic agent, the kind usually used to anesthetize patients before surgery. She hid the syringe in her coat sleeve, where she could draw it in an instant if she had to. She looked at herself in the mirror, a 27-year-old woman with determined brown eyes and a face that no longer carried the marks of fear. She wasn't the trembling girl who'd crawled to the door in a rain-soaked night 5 years ago. She was the mother of 2 boys, a woman who'd gotten back up every time she fell, a fighter Cade had said she was. At 5:45 in the evening, Vivian drove to the south side and parked a block away from the warehouse. She got out, drew a deep breath, and walked toward the darkness. The warehouse was an old brick building, windows shattered, a rusted tin roof sagging above it. Streetlights didn't reach this place. There was only shadow and the damp, rotten smell of abandonment. Vivian stopped at the door, her gaze sweeping the scene, memorizing every exit, every blind corner, everything she might be able to use as a weapon if she had to. She drew another breath, her right hand curling slightly as she felt the ice-cold syringe hidden in her sleeve. Then she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Darkness swallowed her. But Vivian didn't tremble. She wasn't the victim from 5 years ago anymore. This time, she'd come to fight. Inside the warehouse, the darkness was thick as ink, with only a few weak threads of light slipping through shattered windows. Vivian stopped, letting her eyes adjust, and then she saw him. Derek stood in the middle of the space, arms folded across his chest, a vicious smile on his mouth. Behind him were 2 men dressed in black, guns in hand, watching her with cold, flat eyes. Castellano's men, Vivian thought. Derek didn't have the money to hire guards like that. You came alone, Derek said with a sneer as he moved closer. Good girl. I knew you'd do what you were told. Vivian didn't move. Her heart hammered, but her face didn't give him the fear he wanted. I'm here. What do you want? Derek stopped a few steps away, tipping his head as if he were studying an old toy he'd forgotten he still owned. You know what I want. His smile sharpened. The money was just an excuse, ex-wife. I don't need the Mafia bastard's money. He stepped closer, and she caught the stink of alcohol and cigarettes on his breath. I need you. You're mine, Vivian. You've always been mine. You think you can run from me? You think a divorce ends it? Vivian edged back a step, but Derek was faster. He grabbed her by the collar and yanked her in, his eyes bloodshot with a crazed hunger for control. 5 years I've been looking for you. 5 years. And when I find you, you're sleeping with a Mafia boss and you gave him 2 kids? His teeth ground together. You betrayed me, and I'm going to teach you what betrayal costs. The first slap came without warning, snapping Vivian sideways. She stumbled and went down hard on the cold concrete, her ears ringing, her cheek burning. Derek didn't stop. He kicked her in the stomach, folding her in half, stealing her breath. Who the hell do you think you are? He roared, driving another kick into her back. You're nothing but a whore. You're mine, you hear me? Mine. Vivian lay there as pain flooded her body, each breath cutting like a blade through her lungs. The feeling was familiar. 5 years ago, she'd lain on a floor just like this, taking Derek's fists and boots, praying for it to end. But this time was different. This time, She wasn't only enduring, she was watching. Derek was drunk on power, savoring control, not noticing the two gunmen behind him, exchanging uneasy glances. He didn't notice Vivian's right hand moving, slow and deliberate, toward the sleeve of her coat. He didn't notice she wasn't trembling the way she had 5 years ago. "You're coming back with me," Derek said, bending down to grab her hair and wrench her head up. "You'll leave that Mafia bastard, you'll leave those kids, and you'll come back to me. You understand?" Vivian looked straight into his eyes, and something in her brown gaze made him hesitate. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pleading, it was resolve. And before he could react, Vivian moved, fast and precise, using what she'd brought to protect herself in a way that left him suddenly helpless. Derek jerked back, horror widening his eyes. You bitch!" The effect hit him quickly. He staggered as if his body had forgotten how to hold itself upright, then collapsed onto the floor, eyes still open, mind still awake, but his limbs no longer obeying him. The two gunmen lifted their weapons toward Vivian. She shut her eyes and waited for the gunfire. Bang. But there was no pain. She opened her eyes and saw one of the gunmen crumpled to the ground, blood blooming across his chest. Then a second shot, a third, and the other gunman fell too. The warehouse doors flew open, flashlights knifing through the dark, and Cade stepped over the threshold. Behind him came 20 men in black, guns in their hands, faces carved from ice, but no one was colder than Cade in that moment. He walked into the warehouse, his gaze sweeping the scene, taking in Derek lying motionless on the concrete, the two gunmen dead, and Vivian forcing herself upright, her cheek bruising, her lips split and bleeding. Cade stopped in front of her, and Vivian saw something in those gray eyes she had never seen before. Not anger, not even worry. Pain. The pain of watching someone he cared about get hurt. "You're injured," he said, his voice low and controlled, but something trembled beneath the hard shell. Vivian shook her head even though her face throbbed and her body was shaking. "I'm fine." Cade looked down at Derek on the floor, eyes still open, still conscious, yet unable to move. Then he looked back at Vivian, at what she still held in her hand. "You took him down," he said, surprise breaking through despite himself. "Before I got here," Vivian straightened, even as her legs quivered. She looked at Cade, then down at Derek, the man who had haunted her for 5 years of nightmares, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of him anymore. "I told you," she said, her voice rough but steady. "I'm not a victim anymore." Cade stared at her, bruised cheek, blood on her mouth, so like the night 5 years ago when she'd collapsed outside the peninsula. But this time, she wasn't trembling. She wasn't begging. She was standing over her enemy, chin lifted, eyes unbroken. And Cade knew, in that instant, that this woman didn't need him to save her. She was a warrior in the truest sense of the word. She only needed someone willing to fight beside her. Cade walked over to where Derek lay motionless on the warehouse floor, gray eyes cold as ice as he looked down at the man who'd dared threaten his family. Derek couldn't move his body because of the paralytic agent, but his eyes were still open, still awake, still packed with hatred and fear, as he stared up at the Mafia boss towering above him. He tried to smile, a weak, forced smile. "Here to save the princess?" His voice was warped, the drug numbing the muscles in his face. "Gotta say you're a little late, Thornton." Cade didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, looking down at Derek with a gaze Vivian had never seen before. Not blazing anger, not hot, reckless hatred. This was absolute cold, the kind of cold that belonged to a man who'd already decided someone else's fate and wouldn't waver. "No," Cade finally spoke, his voice low and so calm it was terrifying. "She saved herself. I'm here to take out the trash." Derek tried to laugh, but the sound twisted into a groan as the adrenaline drained, and real fear rushed in to fill the space. "You won't dare kill me," he said, his voice shaking even as he tried to pretend he was brave. "Castellano won't let you get away with it. I'm his man. You kill me. You start a war with him." Cade crouched, one knee to the floor, his face only a few centimeters from Derek's. Those gray eyes looked like two bottomless pits of frozen water, and for the first time in his life Derek saw death in someone else's stare. "Castellano sent you in like a dog," Cade said slowly, each word landing like a knife. "You think he cares whether you live or die? You're disposable, a pawn, a one-use tool he'll throw away. He won't start a war over a worthless piece of garbage like you." Derek opened his mouth, trying to say something, to plead, to threaten, but nothing came. He watched Cade draw a gun from his side, watched the black muzzle level toward him, and the last scraps of his fake courage finally split apart under sheer terror. No, wait, I can. A single gunshot cracked through the darkness. One shot, precise, final. And Derek Simmons, the man who'd tortured Vivian through 3 years of marriage that felt like hell, the man who'd haunted her nightmares for 5 years afterward, lay still on the warehouse floor with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, no longer breathing. Vivian stood there and saw it all. Blood. Death. The man who'd been the greatest nightmare of her life ended in 1 second. She waited for fear to crash into her, for disgust, for the sickness that made you want to vomit when you watched someone die right in front of you. But nothing came. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't repulsed. She felt only relief. Relief that Derek would never come back to threaten her again. Relief that the boys were safe. Relief that the nightmare that had stretched across 5 years had finally, truly ended. Cade rose, put the gun away, and turned to her. He walked over and, without a word, bent down and lifted her into his arms. "I can walk," Vivian protested weakly, but her body betrayed her, pain flaring through her ribs when she tried to move. "You're hurt," Cade said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Ribs," Vivian exhaled and let her head rest against his chest because she didn't have the strength to hold herself upright anymore. "Broken again." Cade carried her out of the warehouse, stepping past the bodies of the 2 gunmen, stepping past Derek's body, as if they were nothing but trash that didn't deserve a second glance. Finn was waiting outside with the car, and he opened the door the moment he saw them. "You've got a bad habit," Cade said as he set Vivian into the back seat. "What habit?" she asked, her voice exhausted. "Dangerous men." Vivian gave a small smile even though it pulled at the cut on her lip. "Yeah." Cade slid into the seat beside her and signaled Finn to drive. He didn't speak for a while, just stared out the window, his face unreadable. Then he reached out, took Vivian's small hand, and laced his fingers through hers, warm and certain. "You're a fighter," he said, his voice low. "You just didn't know it yet." Vivian looked down at their hands clasped together, and for the first time, she believed it. She wasn't the helpless victim from 5 years ago anymore. She was the woman who'd struck back, who'd stood up again every time she fell, who'd protected her children at any cost. She was a fighter, and she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Vivian lay on the wide bed in the penthouse bedroom, her ribs wrapped tight, every breath still drawing out a dull, lingering ache. Dr. Shaw had come to examine her in the night, confirming that 2 ribs were broken and that there were many bruises across her body. But there was no internal injury. She needed rest. She needed time to heal. And more than anything, she needed the boys' clothes. Noah and Liam had cried when they saw her come home with her face bruised, and nothing could soothe them except being allowed to climb onto the bed and lie on either side of her. Now, the next morning, the 2 children were still there. Liam curled against Vivian's left side, his head resting on her arm, and Noah on her right, his small hand gripping his mother's as if he feared she might vanish. "Mom," Noah said, his voice small and worried. "Who hit you?" Vivian looked at her son, those gray eyes that looked exactly like Cade's staring up at her with fear and confusion. He was only 5 years old, too young to understand the underworld, the violence, the people who wanted to hurt their family, but old enough to see that his mother was injured, and he deserved the truth, at least part of it. "A bad person," Vivian said softly, stroking Noah's hair. "Someone from a long time ago, from before you and Liam were born, but Dad chased that person away. That person will never come back again." Liam lifted his head, his gray eyes just as worried. "Did Dad protect Mom?" Vivian looked toward the bedroom door, where Cade was leaning against the frame, silently watching them. He'd been there all night, not sleeping, not leaving, only sitting in the chair beside the bed and guarding her as if he feared that if he closed his eyes, even for a moment, someone would come and hurt her again. And now, with morning light spilling through the windows, he stood there with dark circles beneath his eyes from lack of sleep, yet his gaze stayed on her with something she was beginning to recognize for what it was. "Yeah," Vivian said, her eyes still on Cade. "Dad protected Mom." Cade didn't speak, but the corner of his mouth curved slightly, a faint smile only Vivian noticed. Then he tapped the doorframe gently. "You've got a visitor." Vivian frowned. not knowing who would come at a time like this. But before she could ask, a familiar figure appeared behind Cade. Margaret Thornton stepped into the room, still carrying herself with the same pride and chill as always. Yet today there was something different in her eyes. The contempt and hostility were gone. In their place was something almost like respect. She hadn't brought flowers. She hadn't brought a fruit basket. In her hand was a small box wrapped in black velvet. Noah and Liam looked at their grandmother timidly, but Margaret didn't pay them any mind. She walked straight to the bedside, stopped in front of Vivienne, and looked down at the woman lying there with broken ribs and a bruised face. "I heard what happened last night," Margaret said, her voice still cold, but no longer sharp the way it had been before. "You were taken, you were beaten, and you didn't give up the boy's location. You brought him down yourself before my son arrived." Vivienne didn't know what to say, so she only nodded faintly. Margaret studied her for a long moment, as if she were reweighing the woman she'd tried to buy off and erase only a few weeks earlier. Then she opened the black velvet box. Inside lay an old silver bracelet, its surface engraved with delicate, intricate patterns, something that clearly had passed through generations. "This belonged to my mother," Margaret said, her voice dropping lower. "She gave it to me the day I gave birth to Cade. She said it was a Thornton heirloom, meant only for women worthy of standing beside the men of this family." Vivienne looked at the bracelet, then up at Margaret, not trusting what she was hearing. "I can't." "You can," Margaret cut in, her tone final. "And you will." She took the bracelet out of the box, took Vivienne's hand, and fastened it around her wrist. The motion wasn't gentle, it wasn't affectionate, but there was a solemnity to it that Vivienne could feel in her bones. "You're worthy," Margaret said, meeting Vivienne's eyes. "You were ready to die to protect this family. You didn't give up the boys even while you were being beaten. That's who the Thorntons need. That's who my son needs." Silence filled the room. Vivienne stared at the bracelet on her wrist, then looked up at Margaret, tears rising despite her effort to hold them back. This wasn't an apology. Margaret Thornton wasn't the kind of woman who apologized, but it was acceptance. It was her way of saying Vivienne wasn't an outsider anymore. Margaret stood, smoothed the front of her coat, and turned away without another word. No hug, no tears, cold as ever. But before she stepped out, she paused and looked back at Noah and Liam. "Be good," she said shortly. "Take care of your mother." Then she left, and Vivienne lay there staring at the bracelet on her wrist, finally understanding it plain and clear. She was one of them now. She was Thornton family. A year had passed since the fateful night in the Southside warehouse, and Vivienne's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. She still lived in the Gold Coast penthouse with Cade and the boys. She still worked as a nurse at Street Mary, even though Cade had offered more than once for her to stop. She still woke every morning to Noah and Liam's laughter echoing through the apartment. But life wasn't perfect. It had never been perfect, and Vivienne had learned it didn't have to be perfect to be happy. She still woke in the middle of the night from nightmares, dreams of Derek, of fists and boots, of gunfire in that warehouse. She was seeing a therapist once a week now, learning how to face the wounds inside her that time couldn't erase. There were nights she came awake drenched in sweat, her heart skittering out of control, and Cade would be there, holding her in silence until she could sleep again. He didn't ask questions, he simply stayed, and sometimes that was all she needed. Noah and Liam still needed regular surgery once a year to keep their inherited condition under control. Every time she walked them toward the operating room, Vivienne felt as if her heart were being torn in two, even though she knew it was necessary. Even though Dr. Shaw had reassured her hundreds of times, Cade always sat beside her in the waiting room, his hand wrapped around hers. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough. Castellano was still out there, a threat in the shadows. The rival Mafia boss hadn't forgotten that Cade had killed Derek, had eliminated 2 of his gunmen, had challenged him openly. The quiet war between the 2 families continued, and Vivienne knew their safety was always relative. However, Cade did not leave their future to chance. In a swift, clinical strike months after the warehouse incident, he systematically bankrupted Castellano's front companies and exposed his operations to the federal authorities. The man who had once been the king of Chicago was now a fugitive with no throne to return to. Cade had effectively dismantled the spider's web, ensuring that the monster who haunted his father's past would never touch his children's future. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She'd learned how to live with fear. She'd learned she didn't have to face it alone. They faced it together. All of it. Tonight, after the boys had fallen asleep in their room, Vivian stood by the window and looked out over Chicago. The city spread beneath her. Millions of lights glittering like stars spilled onto the earth, and Lake Michigan reflected the moonlight like a vast mirror. She heard footsteps behind her, then felt Cade's warmth as he came to stand beside her, shoulder to shoulder. They stood in silence for a while, looking out at the city, each lost in private thought. Then Cade spoke, his voice low and gentle. "Do you know when I realized I loved you?" Vivian turned to look at him, startled. It was the first time he'd spoken of his feelings so directly. Cade still faced the window, gray eyes distant, as if he were looking back through time. "The night you collapsed outside the peninsula. You were bruised, bones broken, losing blood. Anyone else in your place would have given up." He paused and drew a slow breath. "But your eyes weren't dead. You were still fighting. Even lying on the sidewalk, even when you didn't have the strength to stand, your eyes were still fighting." He turned to her then, and Vivian saw in those gray eyes what she'd tried not to look at for a full year. Love. Deep, fierce, and completely unhidden. "That's when I knew," Cade said. "You were different. You were rare. And I'll never let anyone hurt you again." Vivian felt tears rise, and this time she didn't try to hold them back. "I was afraid of you," she whispered, "for a long time. I was afraid of your world, afraid of the danger, afraid that one day you'd disappear again like you did that night." "And now?" Cade asked, his voice soft. Vivian looked into his eyes, at the man who'd saved her child, who'd protected her, who'd given her a family when she thought she'd be alone forever. "Now I'm afraid of losing you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Cade lifted a hand, brushed her cheek, and wiped away the tear that slipped down. "You won't lose me," he said, a promise in every word. "Not ever again. I missed 5 years. I'm not going to miss one more day." Then he bent down, and for the first time since that night 5 years ago, their mouths met. Not a kiss born of desperation or loneliness. This was the kiss of two people who'd found each other after so much suffering, who'd learned how to trust and love again. When they parted, Vivian looked toward the living room wall, where Liam's newest drawing hung in a place of honor. 4 people holding hands beneath a blue sky. A brown-haired woman, 2 small children, and a tall man. The man had a clear face, with eyes, with a smile. For the first time in all the pictures Liam had ever drawn, the father was smiling. Vivian rested her head on Cade's shoulder, looked at the drawing, and felt a peace she'd thought she'd never have. A family that wasn't perfect, not normal, not absolutely safe, but theirs. And this time, no one was leaving. Vivian and Cade's story is proof of the power of love, of human resilience, and of the faith that no matter how painful the past may be, we can still find happiness if we dare to open our hearts one more time. Sometimes the most beautiful new beginnings come from the most painful endings. Sometimes people find family in the most unexpected places. And sometimes the only thing we need is one person willing to fight beside us. Thank you for following today's story. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share it with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss moving stories every day. I'd really love to know how you feel about this story. Have you ever met someone like Vivian in real life? Or have you ever had to fight alone before you found your person to stand with you? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I always read them, and I treasure every line you share from the bottom of your heart. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and quiet peace every day. Remember, no matter how hard life gets, you never have to face it alone. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.